There is a particular kind of dark that exists only in a prairie farmhouse in January, when the wind is coming sideways off the plains and the nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, across a field that has disappeared entirely into white. In that dark, in every homestead from the Manitoba border to the Alberta foothills, a woman was standing at a wood stove, stirring something. She had been standing there since before sunrise. She would be standing there after the children were in bed. What she was stirring kept everyone alive, and almost nobody remembers what it was. Hi, my name is Jeff, and this is Forgotten Canadian Foods. Every entry on this list came out of a cast iron pot, a root cellar, or a grandmother's hands that never once consulted a recipe card because the recipe lived in the hands themselves. 25 suppers, 1 wood stove, let us count down. Number 25, fried salt pork with mustard gravy. The salt pork came out of the barrel first thing in the morning, soaked in cold water all day to pull some of the brine back out, then sliced thick and laid into a cast iron pan after supper was called. The fat rendered golden and the lean edges crisped dark. The drippings stayed in the pan. Flour went in next, stirred fast until it browned, then water or milk if the cow had given enough, and a spoon of dry mustard that turned the whole thing sharp and bright. Poured over the pork and whatever potatoes had been boiled alongside, mustard gravy was the thing that made a plain supper feel like something had been thought about. Prairie Homestead diaries from the 1920s describe this meal appearing 4 nights a week without complaint from any child at the table. The mustard cut the salt, the gravy stretched the plate, nothing was left. Number 24, barley and root vegetable soup. By February, the root cellar was doing its most important work. Whatever had been pulled from the garden in September was down there in the dark, slowly softening, slowly sweetening. Carrots, turnip, parsnip, onions. A woman who knew her cellar knew exactly what she had left and how long it had to last. Pearl barley went into the pot first, simmered in water with a ham bone or a piece of salt pork until the broth turned cloudy and rich. Then the roots went in, diced rough. The whole thing cooked low and slow until the barley swelled and the vegetables collapsed into the broth, and the soup became thick enough to be a meal on its own. Served with a heel of bread and nothing else, this pot fed 8 people for under 15 cents. Oral histories from Mennonite settlements east of Winnipeg describe barley soup appearing on the supper table every Tuesday and Thursday from November through April without a single person asking for something different. It was not a recipe, it was February. Number 23, creamed dried corn. This one requires an explanation that most people under 60 have never needed. Before a prairie garden was established well enough to produce reliably, and long after the fresh corn of August had come and gone, there was dried corn, cobs dried on wooden racks in the late summer sun, kernels cut free and stored in cloth sacks in the cellar. Come January, those kernels went into a pot of water and simmered for an hour until they rehydrated into something sweet and slightly smoky that fresh corn never quite becomes. Cream went in, and butter if there was any, and salt, and the whole thing thickened into a supper that tasted like August had agreed to stay. Served over biscuits or alongside salt pork, creamed dried corn was the prairie grandmother's proof that August could be made to last until March if you paid attention in August. We now buy fresh corn in January from a country we will never visit. She would find that very strange. Number 22, turnip and salt pork hash. Saturday night on the homestead was not date night. I want to be clear about that. Saturday night was the end of 6 days of labor that would flatten most modern adults by Wednesday, and supper on Saturday needed to be fast and filling, and made from whatever was left in the cellar after the week. Turnip, diced small and boiled until just tender, went into the same pan as the leftover salt pork from earlier in the week. Everything was fried together in the drippings until the edges browned. The turnip caramelized slightly, and the whole pan smelled of salt and sweetness. Some grandmothers added a cold boiled potato. Some added an onion. Some added nothing, because the week had been long and the pan was already on. Eaten directly from the skillet by lamplight, this was not a recipe anyone wrote down because nobody thought it was a recipe. It was just what you did with what was left. That is the whole of it. Number 21, baked bean soup. When the bean pot had been on since Friday night and Sunday supper was finished, and there were still beans in the bottom of the crock, a prairie grandmother did not throw them out. She added water. She put the pot back on the stove. She let those already cooked, already sweetened, already smoky beans dissolve slowly into a thick, mahogany-colored soup that was in every way richer than the original dish, because the flavors had had 2 more days to decide what they wanted to be. A spoonful of dry mustard, a pour of vinegar to brighten it, and whatever scraps of salt pork remained. Served with cornbread or a heel of the week's bread, baked bean soup was the Monday supper that nobody planned and everybody asked for again. Waste was not a moral position on the prairie homestead, it was a practical impossibility. You used what you had because what you had was exactly what you needed. Number 20, wild Saskatoon and pork stew. Stop for a moment. Before the garden, before the railway brought tinned goods within reach, before a Homestead family had been on their quarter section long enough to know the soil, there was a period, sometimes 2 or 3 years. During that time, the land provided almost nothing that had been planted, and almost everything that had grown there on its own terms for 10,000 years before anyone arrived with a plow. Saskatoon berries grew along every coulee and river valley in the west. Blackfoot, Cree, and Nakota peoples had used them for sustenance and ceremony long before the first settler broke ground. Prairie grandmothers of Métis heritage knew exactly what to do when a pot of stewed pork needed depth and sweetness, and there was nothing in the cellar to provide it. Saskatoons went in, the sugar in the berries caramelized against the fat of the pork, and the broth turned a deep purple brown that looked unusual and tasted like something the prairie itself had agreed to give you. This dish did not travel far from the communities where it was made. That is a loss that belongs on this list as much as any recipe. Number 19, oatmeal porridge supper. Yes, supper, not breakfast. When the week had gone badly enough, when the flour was low and the salt pork was down to the last piece and the children needed something warm in their stomachs before bed, a prairie grandmother put the oatmeal pot on at 4 in the afternoon. Not the quick kind. The coarse, stone-cut kind that took 40 minutes of steady stirring and filled the kitchen with a smell that was not exciting but was deeply, thoroughly honest. Served in heavy bowls with a spoon of lard melted in and a pour of blackstrap molasses, oatmeal for supper was not a defeat. It was a decision made by a woman who understood exactly what her family needed and exactly what she had to give it. Children ate without argument. They were warm, they were fed, and the stove was still going when they fell asleep. That was the whole point. Number 18, potato and onion pie. This is not a pie the way a restaurant uses the word. This is a pie the way a homestead uses the word. Something edible was placed inside a lard crust and baked until the crust held together well enough to be sliced. Thinly sliced potatoes, layered with thinly sliced onions, seasoned with salt and pepper, a pour of cream or milk, and a knob of lard between the layers. All of it enclosed in a simple lard pastry and baked low and slow until the potatoes were completely soft and the onions had melted into a sweetness that ran through every layer. Cut into wedges and served straight from the pan, potato and onion pie was the supper that proved a lard crust is not a lesser thing than a butter crust. It is a different thing. And on a cold prairie night with nothing else coming, it was exactly the right thing. Number 17. Dried pea and ham hock soup. The ham hock cost almost nothing at the butcher in 1932 because it was the part nobody else wanted. The prairie grandmother who bought it knew something the butcher did not fully appreciate, which was that the part nobody else wanted was the part that had been sitting closest to the bone for the whole of the animal's life, which meant it had more flavor than anything else in the case. Into a pot went a pound of dried yellow peas soaked overnight, an onion, a bay leaf, and enough water to cover. The pot went on the back of the stove at noon. By 5 o'clock, the peas had dissolved into a thick golden soup, and the meat from the hock had fallen into soft, dark shreds that stirred through every bowl. Eaten with cornbread or dark bread and nothing else, this soup made a Sunday that felt survivable. In the worst years of the dirty 30s, survivable was the aspiration, and this soup met it without complaint. Number 16. Bread pudding with choke cherry sauce. I want to be honest with you about something. Every entry on this list so far has been a practical survival meal, and bread pudding is too. But it is also the entry where a prairie grandmother showed her hand a little, where she revealed that feeding her family was not only about calories and survival, but about making something that tasted like she had thought about them specifically when she made it. Stale bread, and there was always stale bread by Thursday, torn into a baking dish and soaked in a mixture of eggs, milk, a spoon of sugar, and a pinch of cinnamon. Baked until it puffed and set golden on top. And then the choke, cherry sauce. Berries simmered with water, sweetened carefully, and poured warm over everything. The bread pudding cost almost nothing. The choke cherry sauce cost an afternoon in August, purple fingers, and the knowledge to go down to the coulee when the berries were ready. That knowledge is mostly gone now. The sauce never came from a jar. Number 15, cornmeal mush with crackling. Here is what I want you to understand about the meals in the middle of this list. They are not the meals people became embarrassed about later, after prosperity arrived and the grocery store replaced the root cellar, and it became possible to pretend that this period of Canadian history had been more comfortable than it was. These meals in the middle are the ones that were eaten without embarrassment, without nostalgia, without any feeling at all beyond hunger and the fact that supper was on the table. Cornmeal was cooked long and slow into a thick mush, poured into a greased pan, and left overnight. In the morning, it was sliced and fried in lard for breakfast. At supper, what had not been fried was served hot from the pot with crackling stirred through. Those golden rendered bits of pork skin that came from the lard making and cost nothing because they were what was left after everything useful had already been extracted. Cracklings and cornmeal mush turned something plain into something with texture and fat, salt, and depth. Prairie children ate it without knowing there was anything remarkable about it. That is exactly how it should have been. Number 14, venison and root stew. Not every prairie family ran cattle or kept pigs. In the early homesteading years, before a farm had established itself enough to support livestock beyond what was strictly necessary, a family's meat came from the land itself. A deer taken in November could provide a month of protein for a family of 8 if every part was used correctly. The hindquarters went into stew, the shoulders were braised long and slow, the neck went into soup. The venison stew that appeared on homestead tables in the winter months was made with whatever the root cellar held: turnips, carrots, parsnips, potatoes, and cooking liquid seasoned with dried herbs and thickened with flour until the broth clung to the back of a spoon. Prairie grandmothers from Scottish and Irish settlements in the Parkland region described venison stew as the supper that smelled like safety. That description makes complete sense when you understand that a full pot in November meant the family was going to be all right until spring. Number 13, fried bread dough. Every Friday in farmhouse kitchens across the prairie provinces, there was a moment between the bread being mixed and the bread being baked when a grandmother would pinch off a piece of raw dough, flatten it with her palm, and lay it into a pan of hot lard. It puffed and blistered and turned golden in minutes. The children knew this moment. They had been waiting for it all day, eaten hot from the pan, sprinkled with salt, or spread with a scrape of lard and a pour of molasses. Fried bread dough was not the plan. It was what happened while the plan was in the oven. It cost nothing because the dough was already there. I will tell you honestly, if you have never eaten a piece of fresh bread dough fried in lard while it is still too hot to hold properly, you have a gap in your life experience that no restaurant has yet been able to fill. Number 12, salt cod and potato bake. This one traveled inland from the Maritimes on the backs of settlers who could not imagine keeping a kitchen without it. Dried salt cod, soaked for 24 hours to draw the brine back out, layered with sliced potatoes, onion, and a pour of cream or milk in a deep baking dish. The cod rehydrated as it baked, releasing its flavor into the cream and into every layer of potato below it. The top browned and the edges crisped, and what came out of the oven was something that tasted considerably more expensive than it was, which was the constant ambition of every homestead cook who ever lived. A whole dried salt cod cost under $1 and fed a family of 6. Prairie grandmothers who had never seen the ocean made this on Fridays, and it connected them, without their knowing it, to every Catholic fishing family from Newfoundland to Nova Scotia who had made the same dish the same way for 200 years before them. Number 11, bone broth with dumplings. When the meat was gone, the bone stayed. That is the sentence that explains the entire economy of the homestead kitchen. A beef bone, a pork bone, a chicken carcass, whatever was left after the meal had been eaten, went directly into a pot of cold water on the back of the stove and simmered overnight. Sometimes for 16 or 18 hours, until the water had turned into something else entirely. Something dark and glossy and deeply savory that coated the lips and warmed the body from the inside in a way that plain water heated on a stove never could. Into that broth went dumplings. Flour and lard and salt, and just enough water to bring the dough together, were mixed and dropped by the spoonful into the simmering liquid, where they swelled and puffed and turned the broth into a supper substantial enough that nobody left the table hungry. This meal cost nothing. The bone had already been paid for when the roast was bought. The broth was the dividend. Number 10, creamed onions over biscuits. I'm going to tell you something that will sound like I am exaggerating, and I am not exaggerating. There were prairie winters in the 1930s where an entire family's vegetable supply from November through March consisted almost entirely of what was in the root cellar. And in some years, in some cellars, that meant onions, potatoes, and turnip, and not much else. The women who cooked from those cellars were not victims of limited ingredients. They were masters of them. Onions sliced thin and cooked slow in a wide pan with lard until they turned completely soft and golden and sweet, nothing like the sharp raw thing they had started as. A pour of milk, thickened with flour, salt, and pepper, a spoon of dry mustard, if there was any. Poured hot over split baking powder, biscuits that had been made in 20 minutes on the same stove. Creamed onions over biscuits was the supper that turned a root cellar and a bag of flour into something a family actually looked forward to. That is not a small achievement. That is the whole of prairie cooking in a single bowl. Number 9, pork and cabbage stew. Cabbage was the most reliable vegetable a prairie garden produced, and the one that kept longest in the cold cellar without turning. A head of cabbage in September was still a head of cabbage in January if you knew where to store it, and every prairie grandmother knew exactly where to store it. Quartered and added to a pot of simmering salt pork and water with an onion and a handful of dried herbs, cabbage gave up its sweetness slowly into the broth and absorbed the salt and fat of the pork until the two things became something neither had been alone. Thickened with a handful of barley or a spoon of flour stirred in at the end, Pork and cabbage stew was the supper that appeared reliably through January and February and March on every homestead that had done its garden work correctly in September. Some grandmothers added a splash of vinegar at the end. That splash of vinegar is not a small detail. That splash of vinegar is the difference between a good supper and a great one. Number 8, baked stuffed potatoes with salt pork. The potato was the most democratic food the prairie produced because it grew reliably in almost every soil type across the West. And it's stored without any processing beyond a cold, dark room. A baked potato is not a recipe in the sense that most people mean the word. But a baked potato stuffed with the rendered drippings and crisped bits of salt pork and returned to the oven until the skin blistered and the filling was hot and everything had merged into a single thing. That is a supper. Oral histories from Ukrainian settlements north of Vegreville in Alberta describe this dish as the Friday meal when the week had gone well enough that there was pork fat to spare. That meant it was also a meal that told you something about how the week had gone without anyone needing to say a word. A good week had stuffed potatoes. A hard week had plain ones. The potato was never the problem. The potato always showed up. Number 7, milk toast. Set aside what the phrase milk toast has come to mean in modern English. As an insult, meaning bland or spineless, it has erased the memory of what it actually was. It was a real supper that real families ate on real nights. When the pantry was low, the children were tired, and something warm was the only requirement. Thick slices of day-old bread toasted on the stovetop in a dry pan until golden were laid into a wide bowl and covered with hot milk that had been warmed on the stove with a knob of butter and a pinch of salt. Some grandmothers added a spoon of sugar, some added nothing. The bread softened in the milk cooled slightly around the bread, and what you had was warm and soft and simple in a way that a tired child at the end of a January day needed more than anything complex or impressive. Milk toast was the supper that asked nothing of anyone and gave back exactly what was needed. We renamed it an insult and forgot it existed. That seems like the wrong call. Number 6, smoked whitefish chowder. Prairie grandmothers who settled near the lakes of Manitoba and Saskatchewan had access to something the dryland homesteaders further west did not. Freshwater fish were smoked in autumn and kept through winter without refrigeration. The ingredients were smoked whitefish shredded from the bone, diced potato, onion, a knob of lard, and enough milk to make it a chowder. It was simmered low until the potatoes softened, and the smoked fish distributed itself through every spoonful. The smokiness was the whole point. It turned a simple milk and potato soup into something that tasted of autumn and the specific intelligence of knowing that the fish running in September were the protein that would carry your family through March. In Icelandic and Ukrainian settlements around Lake Winnipeg, this chowder appeared with the kind of regularity that means it was not a recipe. It was a calendar. Number 5, brown butter and potato soup. This soup is so simple, it sounds like I have left something out. I have not left anything out. Potatoes diced and boiled with an onion and salt until falling apart. Half mashed against the side of the pot to thicken the broth, half left in pieces for texture. Then, in a separate pan, a spoon of lard cooked over high heat until it turned golden brown and smelled of something between nuts and caramel. Poured directly into the soup where it hissed and bloomed through every bowl. That browned fat was the entire flavor of the meal. It transformed boiled potatoes and water into something that tasted like intention. Prairie women made this in the worst years of the dirty 30s with the same care they brought to everything. The people at their table deserve to be fed well. They always believe that. Number 4, rendered lard on rye with pickled vegetables. This is where I need to stop and say something directly. These entries are not here because they are exotic or forgotten in the way specialty foods become forgotten. They are here because prosperity taught an entire generation to be ashamed of them. And shame is the most efficient eraser of cultural memory that has ever existed. A thick slice of dark rye spread with soft white lard, salted, eaten alongside homemade pickled beets or mustard pickle put up in September. This was supper on the nights when supper was the edge of what was possible. The women who ate it did not eat it with shame. The rye gave starch, the lard gave warmth, the pickled vegetables gave acid, and the vitamins a prairie winter did its best to take away. This was not poverty food. This was precision. The shame came later. It was not earned. Number 3, whole grain porridge with drippings and preserved onions. There is a homestead diary kept by a woman named Margaret Flett between 1918 and 1931, in which she records supper for nearly every night of those 13 years. On over 100 separate occasions, the meal was whole grain porridge with whatever fat and preserved vegetable remained. Not because she lacked imagination, but because she was feeding 7 children on a quarter section with a husband sick for 3 of those years. Wheat berries or cracked rye simmered for hours on the back of the stove. Drippings were poured hot over the top. Preserved onions were put up in September. Together, they kept 7 children alive through years the history books describe in the abstract, and Margaret Flett recorded in the specific. Her name deserves to be here as much as any recipe. Number 2, buttermilk and cornbread supper. When a prairie family kept a cow, the buttermilk left after churning never went to waste. The purpose was cornbread, not the sweet, cakey thing that appears in modern recipes. This was cornmeal, flour, lard, salt, baking powder, and enough buttermilk to bring it together into a thick batter, baked in a cast iron pan until the bottom went dark and became slightly crunchy from the lard beneath it. Served warm alongside whatever soup was on the stove, it sopped the bowl clean when the soup was gone. The buttermilk gave the crumb a faint sharpness that balanced the fat in a way no other liquid could. A full pan cost under 5 cents in 1928. The cow made it possible. The grandmother made it worth eating. Number 1, the supper that had no name. Every prairie grandmother had one dish that did not have a name because it had never needed one. The supper she made when the week had taken everything, and the cellar had been visited one too many times, and the children were hungry, and the stove was hot. It was a nameless ritual, and it was ordinary. It was different every time and always the same. Whatever fat was in the pan went first. Whatever starch remained, potato or dried corn or a heel of bread torn up, went next. Whatever preserved or leftover thing was in the cellar came after. It cooked together until the edges crisped and the center softened, and the whole thing decided to become a meal. It was served in the pan. There were no leftovers. Nobody asked what it was called. The name of it was supper. Supper was what there was. Supper was enough. Food historians can catalog the 24 entries that came before this one. They can trace the origins of salt cod to the Maritimes, buttermilk cornbread to the American South, and dried pea soup to habitant farmhouses in Quebec. But this last meal, the one with no name, made by a woman standing at a wood stove in January light with whatever she had, and however much love can be contained in an act of daily provision, that one belongs only to the kitchen where it was made. And to the children who ate it and grew up and had their own children and forgot somewhere along the way what it cost to make something out of almost nothing. Hit subscribe. Tell me in the comments which entry your grandmother made. And if you still know the name she called it, write that down too, because that name is history, and history has a way of disappearing faster than any of us plan for.